Hello, beautiful community. We need to talk about Ukraine's spring counteroffensive. And the point here is it's got an enormous political significance that I think is underestimated and also distorted by being seen through the prisms of very different kind of spectacles that misrepresent the political reality that Ukraine is facing, the political threat that Russia is posing, and the political choices that we in the West are facing. And I think in this conversation I'm going to be mean to virtually all sides, but also a bit mean to the side that many of you take. So that's why we've had to wheel out the Vlad in a blue shirt, because the Vlad in the white shirts is nicer. This is the mean Vlad. There's lots of doubles about pretty much anybody these days. So that's the kind of reality we're living with. So this is one of the doubles. He's meaner, and he's probably going to be mean to some of you during the course of this video. But this is a really important conversation. It's a kind of a practical application of all the things we've been talking about for months and months and months. So let's name some of the parties involved in the conflicts about what the West should do in the West. One party says, let's sort of push for a reasonable, quote unquote, solution and a peace deal now. Now, for reasons we have endlessly discussed, I believe that that is not, so to say, an unjust proposal as much as a proposal that has no traction with reality. Ukraine doesn't have a peace option now. Nobody wants peace more than Ukrainians. Ukraine does not have a peace option, and suing for peace today would be a very direct attack on Ukrainian security in the short term and very much so in the medium term. That option ain't available. And so that argument needs to be heard. It's part of our conversation. We should absolutely platform that argument. But it's an unethical evasion of political reality, actually. Now, there is a second, much more reasonable argument that I would say the majority of the most sensitive commentators and public intellectuals in the West are taking. That's not a lot of people, because I've just said that these are the sensitive folks. So how does that argument go? That argument goes like this. Ukraine has every damn right to fight for its independence, for its right to keep its territories, for its cultural integrity that is being questioned with bombs by Russians who are backing up their brutal invasion with genocidal rhetoric, and who are not invading Ukraine to chop off a little bit of Ukraine. They're invading Ukraine to engage in a regime-stabilizing provocation of the West, provocation against the West, that also happens to essentially erase Ukraine. So bloody hell, these sensitive intellectuals say, of course it's understandable that Ukraine wants victory here, but the problem is that Berlin, Paris, Washington might want Ukrainian survival, not victory. Ukrainian independence, not victory. A compromise that keeps Ukraine intact, that keeps Ukraine's sovereignty intact, that keeps Ukraine's government in place, and whatever process the government goes through to, renew itself, whether upcoming parliamentary or presidential elections happen or not. And that position has, even though it's nearly the best position out there because it's better than the others, but that position itself has a significant flaw. And that's that it risks misunderstanding the intent of the Kremlin, which is that it's not fighting against Ukraine, but that it's mobilizing itself toward a big confrontation with the West, whatever happens in Ukraine. So, allowing Ukraine to fight and supporting Ukraine to fight on until Ukraine decides it can't or doesn't want to anymore, right? It is a incomparably more realistic and better position than the first position, which says let's make a peace deal now. But it's a position that still risks missing out on the fact that the ambitions of the Kremlin, again restated today by the clown Lavrov, he is a clown, but some of these statements are part of Kremlin thinking legitimately that they are into a reconstitution of the world order, a kind of disordering of the world order, and a fundamental undermining of a certain kind of hold they see the West have on international affairs. That stuff is what we're up against, and that stuff isn't going to go away until the Kremlin is defeated. Right? So that's the problem for this view that says, yes, Ukraine is rightly committed to victory, but the West is committed to Ukrainian survival, but not necessarily to victory. And we're just going to see what happens. That just means Ukraine giving it another few goes, or just another go in the spring counteroffensive, and it doesn't look too revolutionary what Ukraine manages to do, then we have to say, well, okay, let's move toward now recognizing that you have survived, you are an independent state, but Russia's going to have Crimea and the Donbass and so on. Now, that is an enormously politically realistic position, but it still misses out on the fact that that stuff coming out of the Kremlin ain't stopping until it's stopped. So that's the flaw with this position. Now let's move to another position. And this is the position of many people in this community. And that's that the West is committed. So this is a different position. This is less a normative position. This is more a kind of an interpretive position. But it's a position that the West is in the end committed to Ukrainian victory. And that little by little we're making steps in that direction. And that's why we need to talk, because we're not. I mean, we might be a bit, but this is a situation of enormous uncertainty. And here's the deal. Ukraine's counteroffensive is to some extent going to decide whether Western support escalates, or at least continues, or to some extent dies down. The better Ukraine does and the more it surprises the world, I think the more support it's likely to get. The less well Ukraine does, the less support it's likely to get going forward. What does that mean? It means that there is a good chance, and it's uncertain, so we can't put a 10% or a 50% on it, but you could, for the benefit of giving yourself a psychological clue about what's likely, but you could have a situation where Ukraine makes some positive progress with a counteroffensive, but essentially we're still stuck half a year from now with a kind of stalemate that then freezes in one form or another for a year or 2 years or 3 years, during which time the EU deflates, US support is compromised, and Russia mobilizes politically, mobilizes militarily, and continues reconstituting its economy to generate some more sustained capacity for conducting wars, and then starts a war again, and not even necessarily against Ukraine. if Ukraine's counteroffensive does not go well, the odds of that kind of scenario are uncertain but eminently realistic. Eminently realistic. And the advice I want to give you very strongly is the fact that one becomes more concerned about Ukraine's prospects is no reason to stop supporting Ukraine. If anything, the opposite. Right? Now, I know in this sense this community is not very representative of the general populations in all the countries you come from, because you tilt more tendentiously on this issue toward supporting Ukraine. But even some of you, a minority of you, will lose interest. And don't write me in the comments that you won't, because there's always the most engaged people who express an opinion, and that's actually not representative. But there's a minority of you who will begin giving up on Ukraine the less compelling Ukraine's chances look of fundamentally shifting the situation by military means from whatever we've got now. And that will be on a power of 2 or 3 replicated in the wider populations in your countries. So we've got the position that Ukraine needs to negotiate now that is wrong. We've got the position that is one that says that Ukraine should fight now, that we should support Ukraine to fight, but that eventually we will be sort of in a position where we have to admit that the West wants Ukraine's survival and Ukraine wants victory, and there's going to be an increasingly gap between these two. And that's a view that is enormously realistic, but it has that flaw of not understanding fully the escalatory intent of the Kremlin. And then there is this third position which says that we do in fact support Ukraine to win, and that that's the direction in which we're heading. And that position is a different kind of misjudgment. It's a misjudgment that perhaps some of us in this community are under, and I know that a very small percentage of people in this community are very much under that impression, such that when we say that the West is not committed to a full Ukrainian victory, there's people writing like, what's your evidence for this? Give me an example of proof. But that itself, that kind of question is itself an expression of an incapacity to face this reality, because it's an interpretive judgment. So nobody's going to give one a fact about something that is a matter of interpretive judgment. So that misconception is also very, very dangerous. It allows you to sleepwalk, and this is where we're getting to the center of this conversation, to sleepwalk into the reality that if Ukraine does not manage to defeat or go a long way toward defeating Russia this year, then we'll just work it out later and Ukraine will simply get there in time. Whereas the truth is that defeating or going as close as possible to defeating Russia as soon as possible is actually really, really important for Ukraine. And that the further out we go, the more difficult things are going to get. And that the odds of us going further out and things getting really difficult are high. And, we don't give percentages for uncertainties, but they're high. And the longer this goes on, and the longer we have a situation that looks like some kind of a relative stalemate, the more this benefits Mr. Putin. And if this sustains for 2 and 3 years, it seems to me that the overwhelming likelihood, on the balance of all kinds of political interpretations I'm not going to go through now, the situation will be tilting in Mr. Putin's favor. So there is a special importance to the spring counteroffensive, because in many ways it's plausible that it could decide a lot that it going well could decide a lot, and that it not going well could decide a lot. And there is a possibility that is not trivial, that this is a certain kind of last chance for Ukraine to bounce the turn of events away from the increasingly inevitable conclusion. Now I'm slightly exaggerating this, which says, okay, now it's time to settle for survival and independence. And this is what we're all telling you here in Washington, Paris, Berlin, and indeed in London. So thank you for letting me have this conversation, which is perhaps the beginning of a conversation with you. But I think that's the kind of landscape where we're looking at this with. And this peculiarly means that what happens on the field of battle is actually going to be the thing which potentially has the most political importance than any decision that could be made anywhere in any major sort of, European and North American capital. So there is this sort of completely insupportable flaw with the let's negotiate position. There's somewhat of a flaw with the position that says Ukraine has every right to go for victory, but that's not going to align with the position of the major powers who want Ukrainian independence and survival. And eventually there's going to have to be something that gives. Well, that position misses out a bit on the considerations that are really important, that I've been drilling endlessly into this smartphone for a year, about the pattern of escalation the Kremlin is on, and that there's a kind of a risk with a somewhat sort of Soviet studies mindset of not understanding this escalatory situation, that the regime is now aligned to being at war with the West, and that ain't going to go away until the regime collapses. And now then there is this sort of third view, which I've included, even though it's not a view about what should happen, it's a view about what is happening, which I think risks being too rose-tinted, and indicates the fact that while there are understandable limitations on what the West can do for Ukraine, the argument for doing always more and exploring how to do more has enormous significance. And sometimes doing more also means stating your position clearly. Right? And that also matters. And so that in practice would mean shifting further away from the current position, which is independence and survival, toward closer, at least, toward a rapid victory for Ukraine. But that's the outcome we're getting at. This is difficult stuff, but it's very important to be realistic about all of this. So I'll be back saying all of that much more coherently soon, I think. And I wanted to, via the use of me and Vlad, to share this ramble with you. Lots of love for now.